There's a moment in season 3 that I keep coming back to. After everything with Woodbury, after the governor and the tanks and the people who came through the prison fence and the people who didn't make it back, Rick says something to Michonne that sounds like a policy decision but feels like a wound. We don't go out anymore. We bring people in. A rule for strangers. A wall made of words rather than chain links. And what's interesting is not the rule itself. It's that Rick had to make it at all. Because before Woodbury, before Shane, before the Atlanta camps last night, Rick had trusted the way most of us trust. Quietly, by default, without thinking of it as a choice. And now it was a choice. A careful one. A costly one. What if that shift from instinctive trust to deliberate, rationed trust is what The Walking Dead has always been about? Tonight, let's find out together. Glenn Rhee picks up a radio in a tank. He doesn't know who's on the other end. He doesn't know if the voice asking for help is worth trusting or whether answering will cost him something he can't afford to spend. He answers anyway. "Hey you, dumbass." And with that line, funny and warm, and a little exasperated, Glenn extends trust to a complete stranger in a situation where extending trust is operationally insane. The camp is nearby. There are walkers everywhere. He has no information about this man. He trusts him with his location and his attention, and eventually, over the course of that pilot episode, his life. That's Season 1, Episode 1, the first act of trust in the entire franchise, and it's immediately costly. Following Rick's plan nearly gets Glenn killed. He's surrounded, separated, endangered by the very man he chose to help. Glenn survives, but the cost is there from the very beginning. Built into the first act of reaching towards a stranger in a world that has just stopped rewarding that reaching. This is the pattern The Walking Dead establishes before the first episode is over. Trust is present, trust is costly, and the person who trusts most openly, most reflexively, most generously, without the careful calculation that survival should probably require, is already marked by that quality as the person who will eventually pay the highest price. Glenn is, from his first radio call, the franchise's most hopeful person. He is also, from that same moment, the person most likely to be destroyed by the world's response to that hope. Morgan trusts Rick in that same episode. He opens his house to a stranger, shares food and information, and the specific grief of his situation, his wife, the window, the rifle he cannot bring himself to fire. He trusts Rick with the weight of what he's carrying. And what does that trust cost him? In the immediate term, nothing catastrophic. But in the long term, the trust Morgan extends to the possibility of human connection, of someone coming back and helping him, of the world eventually offering something worth holding on to. That trust erodes over years and silence and the impossible weight of what happens next into the broken, trapped Morgan that Rick finds in Season 3's Clear. Morgan trusted, and the world didn't respond in the way trust is supposed to be met. And what's left when trust is extended and not returned over and over is something that barely resembles the person who started extending it. The Atlanta camp at the perimeter, this is the fence in its original form. The boundary between the people who are in and the people who are out. Between the known world and the unknown one. In Season 1, that perimeter is watched by Dale from the top of the RV, and the watching is a form of trust management. Someone has to be responsible for knowing what's on the other side. The camp exists because people trusted each other enough to stay in one place. to build watch schedules, to share resources, and the camp is destroyed in the Season 1 finale because the trust the camp was built on, the trust that the perimeter was sufficient, that the watch system worked, that the camp's vulnerability was manageable, turned out to be, as so much trust in this universe turns out to be, a bet that came due. If trust was already costly in episode 1, what does the franchise think trust is actually for? I think the answer might be not for safety, not primarily. Trust in this universe is for belonging, for the experience of being in the world with other people who have chosen, in some partial and fragile way, to be responsible for you. The cost is part of the deal. The cost is, in a strange way, proof that the trust is real. Because cheap trust isn't trust. It's just an assumption. And The Walking Dead, in every form they take, are the franchise's argument that assumptions don't survive contact with the world as it actually is. Shane Walsh and Rick Grimes were partners before the world ended. That means something specific. Two men who work together in conditions of genuine risk, who had to be able to trust each other's judgment in situations where the wrong call could cost both of them their lives. That kind of professional trust built through repeated small demonstrations, through showing up reliably when the situation required it, through the accumulated weight of time spent in each other's company under pressure, is the strongest kind of trust the old world produced. And The Walking Dead spends 2 seasons destroying it. Not because Shane is secretly evil from the beginning. That's not what the show does. Shane is someone who adapted to the new world faster than Rick, and whose adaptation required accepting that the old world's rules, including the rules about loyalty between friends, didn't fully translate. He believed Rick was dead. He made decisions based on that belief. He built a new life provisionally from the wreckage, and then Rick came back, and the new life had to be dismantled, and the dismantling revealed that Shane's model of the world had drifted far enough from Rick's, that the trust between them was no longer operating on the same foundation. They were using the same word, loyalty, to mean different things. And that gap, quiet at first, widened until it could only be closed with violence. Laurie Grimes is at the centre of this trust fracture in a way the show doesn't always get credit for. Her situation, loving Rick, having turned to Shane during what seemed like widowhood, carrying the pregnancy that complicated everything, meant that she was living inside both trust relationships simultaneously, and her presence kept the fracture from closing, not through any malice, just through the specific impossibility of the situation. The pre-apocalypse trust structure, marriage, partnership, loyalty to specific named people, didn't survive the apocalypse's first reordering. New configurations formed under pressure. And when the old structures reasserted themselves, the new ones had to break. Carol's exile in Season 4 is a different kind of trust fracture, and I think it's worth sitting with because it reveals something specific about Rick's model. Rick exiled Carol unilaterally, no council, no group decision, no consultation with the people who had trusted her and been protected by her. He made the call alone and then told the group afterward. And here's what's interesting about that sequence. Rick trusted Carol enough to believe she could survive alone, trusted her enough to tell her the truth about why he was exiling her, trusted his own read on the situation enough to act on it without anyone else's input, but he didn't trust the group's judgment about Carol's value to them. He didn't trust Daryl, who cared about Carol deeply, to be able to receive the information and make a fair assessment. The exile reveals that Rick's trust model has a specific architecture. He trusts individuals in the immediate register and distrusts collective judgment when the collective judgment might contradict his own. Trust in The Walking Dead breaks at exactly the point where survival and loyalty diverge. When one person calculates that another person's cost to the group has exceeded their value. Shane makes that calculation about Rick's group in a different direction. He calculates that his own survival value justifies choices that loyalty would otherwise prohibit. Rick makes it about Carol, and the breaking point in each case is not a single betrayal, but a long accumulation of diverging definitions, until the trust relationship is a word that both parties are still using to describe something that no longer exists between them. If Shane was Rick's most trusted person before the world ended, and by all the evidence of their partnership he was, what does it mean that even that trust couldn't survive the crisis? I think it means The Walking Dead is making an early, clear statement. The crisis doesn't test trust, it reveals what trust was always made of. The trust between Rick and Shane wasn't strong enough to hold their diverging models of the world together. Maybe it never was. Maybe the old world structures just postponed the revelation long enough that both of them had time to believe in it. The governor builds a library. He maintains a community vegetable garden. He organizes watch schedules, community meetings, a semblance of governance that gives Woodbury's residents a sense of agency and participation. He is charming, specifically and deliberately charming. The kind of charm that comes from genuinely understanding what people need to feel safe and providing it, not through accident, but through studied attention to human need. He is, in this specific register, brilliant, and he is the franchise's clearest argument that trust can be manufactured, constructed, not grown, and that manufactured trust works for a while in ways that genuine trust might actually not. Andrea's relationship with the governor in Season 3 is the most scrutinized trust relationship in the franchise, and I want to approach it with the care it deserves. Andrea is not naive. She has survived through the winter between Season 2 and 3. She has watched enough people die to have calibrated, repeatedly, her read on human danger. She is perceptive and capable, and she trusts the governor. Not blindly, she has doubts, she notices things, she asks questions, but she trusts the version of the world he offers, which is a version where warmth and safety and something resembling normal life are still available, because the specific thing the governor provides is not just physical safety, he provides narrative safety, a story about the world that makes it comprehensible, livable, worth waking up inside. And that is a profound thing to offer a person who's been living in incomprehensibility for months. Andrea doesn't trust the governor because she's foolish. She trusts him because he has identified, with unusual precision, the specific form of trust she most needs. The form that says, the world still makes sense, and I am part of the reason it makes sense, and you can rest inside that for a while. And that form of trust, manufactured though it is, meets a real human need. The tragedy of Andrea's arc is not that she trusted the wrong person. It's that the right kind of trust, the kind the governor offered, a trust that allowed rest, turned out to be constructed on a foundation of complete fabrication. Woodbury's walls are the fence in its most elaborate form. Not just a physical barrier, but an architectural argument. The world outside is chaos, and the world inside is order, and the governor is the thing that makes the difference. The walls say, out there, you cannot trust anything. In here, you can trust the governor. Every physical wall in the franchise performs some version of this argument. But Woodbury's walls are specifically designed to prevent the people inside from seeing what the walls are made of. Not just concrete and steel, but information control, narrative management, the careful curation of what Woodbury's residents were allowed to know about the world outside and the man who governed it. The show keeps giving us villains who understand trust better than its heroes. Negan later will do this even more completely, but the governor is the original demonstration. A person who has looked at the mechanics of trust, understood what makes it function, and constructed a replication so precise that the people living inside it can't easily tell the difference between their trust and a real one. What does that tell us about trust itself? It suggests uncomfortably that trust may not have an inside that's different from its outside. That trust is, at some level, a social performance that becomes real through repetition and shared investment, and that what the governor built was not so different in form from what any community builds when it asks its members to believe in each other. If the governor built a more stable trust structure than Rick did, and for a while he arguably did, Woodbury was more stable internally than the prison was. What does that say about what trust actually requires to function? My honest answer, framed as interpretation rather than certainty, trust might require less sincerity than we want it to. It might require instead consistency and the provision of the specific needs that the trusting party most urgently has. The governor provided those things, which is why his system worked. What it couldn't survive was contact with reality, with the specific version of the world that existed outside Woodbury's managed narrative. And that, in the end, is the difference between manufactured trust and the real thing, not the inside, the outside. What happens when the story the trust is built on meets the world as it actually is? And that's where the pattern starts to click. Or at least it might. Glenn Rhee and Maggie Green meet at a pharmacy outside Herschel's farm in Season 2. The meeting is practical, a supply run, and the trust that develops between them is, in the early stages, practical too. They have compatible skills, complementary abilities, a shared interest in not dying. But The Walking Dead doesn't let Glenn and Maggie's trust stay practical for long. It deepens, becomes personal, becomes the specific and unrepeatable thing between two specific people that the franchise keeps insisting is the most important and most dangerous thing a person in this world can have. What's worth noticing about their trust is how hard it is. Glenn hides things from Maggie. His near-death experiences, his fears, the specific weight of what the supply runs cost him. He doesn't tell her everything, not because he doesn't trust her, but because telling her everything would mean making her carry what he's carrying, and part of his love is the instinct to protect her from that weight. Maggie carries things Glenn can't fully reach. Her grief for her family, her fear of loving someone she might lose, the specific complexity of a woman rebuilding her world around a man she met in its ruins. Neither of them is fully transparent to the other. The trust between them is not based on complete knowledge. It's based on the consistent choice to be present, to keep showing up, to treat the other person's life as something worth protecting at personal cost. Glenn's death in the Season 7 premiere is the franchise's most devastating trust event. And I want to approach it carefully because I think it's often read as an argument against trust, and I think it might be the opposite. Glenn lunges forward toward Negan, toward the violence being done to Abraham, because he cannot stop himself from responding to someone he loves being hurt. He moves before the calculation can stop him, and Negan kills him for it. The specific quality that makes Glenn Glenn, the reaching, the movement toward rather than away, the inability to hold himself still when someone needs him, is exactly what ends him. Glenn is killed by his own trust, not by naivety, not by a mistake, by the fullest expression of who he is. Some fans read this as the show saying, "Trust will destroy you." Others read it as, "This is what trust looks like when it's the real thing, and the real thing is worth the cost of it, even when the cost is everything." I find myself in the second camp, though I hold the ambiguity, because the show doesn't frame Glenn's death as a warning. It frames it as a loss, a real, unjust, unbearable loss, and the difference matters. A warning would imply he should have been different. The loss implies the world should have been different. Glenn was right. The world was wrong. And trust, when it produces people like Glenn Rhee, is doing something right, even when it costs the most. Maggie carries this knowledge into everything she does afterward. The hilltop, the war, Dead City. She makes different choices than Glenn would have made. Harder choices, more calculating ones. Choices that require holding the trust at arm's length, rather than walking into it with her full body. But she doesn't stop trusting. She just trusts differently, more slowly, more provisionally, more like someone who knows what the bill looks like when it arrives. Glenn and Maggie's trust is the franchise's clearest statement that trust is worth having. And then the show tests that statement by taking Glenn, by demonstrating, in the most final way available, the price of being the kind of person who trusts the way Glenn trusts. The test doesn't resolve cleanly. It leaves you with both things at once, the worth of the trust and the price of it, and no clean answer about whether they balance. That might be the most honest thing the franchise has ever done. Negan arrives in the Walking Dead universe with a bat wrapped in barbed wire and a very specific understanding of how trust works. He doesn't trust in the traditional sense. He doesn't believe in the mutual vulnerability that genuine trust requires, doesn't believe the risk is worth taking at the personal level. What he believes in and has built an empire around is the managed deployment of trust as a resource. Who trusts whom, in what direction, through what channels, under what conditions, these are the variables Negan controls. And the sanctuary's "we are all Negan" structure is the logical extension of that control. If every saviour is Negan, then no saviour trusts another saviour as a distinct person. All trust routes through Negan. All loyalty is expressed toward him. The horizontal trust relationships, the kind that build genuine community, the kind Glenn and Maggie had, are structurally suppressed. This is, from a pure control standpoint, brilliant. Horizontal trust is dangerous to a power structure because it creates alternative loyalties. If the saviours trusted each other, they might eventually trust each other more than they trust Negan. They might organise. They might recalculate. The "we are all Negan" system prevents this by making personal identity, the foundation that makes trust between individuals possible, into something that belongs to the structure rather than the individual. You can't fully trust someone who doesn't have a self that's separate from the system, and that's the point. Negan's redemption arc, across seasons 8 through 11 and into Dead City, is the franchise's most extended exploration of whether trust, once broken catastrophically, can be rebuilt. And the specific form that rebuilding takes is worth attention. Negan doesn't rebuild trust through apology, exactly. He rebuilds it through demonstrated behavioural change over time, through moments where he could have acted in his own interest and chose differently, through the specific and costly act of being useful to people who have every reason to wish him harm. His relationship with Carl in Season 8 is the most surprising version of this. A boy who had genuine moral clarity and the willingness to extend something like trust to a man who terrified his father. Carl saw something in Negan that Carl's father couldn't afford to see. And Carl's death didn't end that conversation. It carried forward in Carl's letter, in the vision Rick eventually felt obligated to try to honour. With Judith in later seasons, Negan does something similar. He becomes, in the specific context of an Alexandria that isn't ready to fully forgive him, someone who is genuinely useful and occasionally genuine. The trust she extends toward him is not naive. Judith is not naive, has never been naive, carries the careful wisdom of someone raised in catastrophe. She trusts the version of Negan she can observe, the one who showed up, who kept showing up, who treated her with a consistency that the people she trusted most had also demonstrated. It's not forgiveness, it's pattern recognition. It's the specific form trust takes when trust has already been expensive. Dead City is where Maggie and Negan's trust question reaches its most compressed form. She needs him. That's the fact. She needs what he's capable of in a place that requires capabilities she doesn't have. And she extends a provisional, eyes open, deeply uncomfortable version of trust to Sadiula, not because she's forgiven him, but because the alternative is failing the mission and losing something she can't afford to lose. What that trust costs her emotionally is visible in every scene between them. The silence she keeps, the way she watches him, the very careful distance she maintains even when proximity is required. That's not distrust. That's the specific form trust takes after catastrophic betrayal. Provisional, visible, carefully bounded, maintained through ongoing observation rather than assumption. If Negan can rebuild trust with the people he hurt most, does that mean trust is more resilient than the show usually implies? I think it might. But I want to be careful about what kind of resilience we're talking about. The trust Maggie extends to Negan in Dead City is not the trust Glenn extended in Season 2. It's not warm, not generous, not moving toward, it's functional. Earned through demonstration. Maintained through vigilance. It's real trust, but it's been through things that change its shape permanently. Resilience in trust in this universe doesn't mean returning to the original form. It means surviving into a different one. Carol Pelletier is the franchise's most complete portrait of a person who is both trustworthy and impossible to fully trust. This is not a contradiction in her character. It's the most honest thing about her. She has been across the seasons a victim, a protector, a killer, a warm neighbour, a strategic genius operating under elaborate cover, a broken person trying and occasionally failing to hold herself together. She has performed the role of harmless housewife at Alexandria with such commitment that the community genuinely didn't see her as a threat, while simultaneously being in that same period one of the most capable and dangerous people inside the walls. She has, in other words, presented different versions of herself to different people in different contexts, and none of those versions is false and none of them is complete. Carol is all of it. The layering is not deception in the villainous sense. It's survival. It's the specific defense of a person who learned, early and at great cost, that being fully known was the most dangerous thing she could be. And yet, the Daryl relationship. Daryl Dixon, who is himself a person constructed around a kind of controlled non-disclosure, who grew up in circumstances that taught him, as Carol's circumstances taught her, that full visibility was a liability, sees Carol in a way that is different from how anyone else in the franchise sees her. Not completely, not without gaps, but with a specific and consistent acceptance of the parts he can see, alongside the parts he can't. They don't talk about everything. They have never, in any scene, laid out the full accounting of who they are to each other, but they show up. Daryl shows up for Carol. Carol shows up for Daryl. The trust between them is not based on full knowledge, it's based on reliable presence, the consistent behaviour across time that means, even when you don't know what the other person is doing or why, you trust that they're doing it in a way that won't abandon you. The season 10 arc is Carol at her most isolated. The grief over Henry driving her into decisions that nearly get her killed. The cave sequence where she made calls that put people in danger. The slow and painful rebuilding of something recognizable in herself. And Daryl is there through it, not by understanding everything she's going through, not by having the words for it, not by offering the kind of articulate processing that some of the other characters do. He's there because he's there. His presence is the form his trust takes. And in a relationship between two people who are both better at action than language, that presence as trust is the most they can offer each other, and the most either of them needs. Can you fully trust someone you don't fully know? The Walking Dead, through Carol and Daryl's arc, seems to be suggesting something nuanced here. Full knowledge may not be the requirement trust actually has. The requirement might be behavioural consistency, the reliable demonstration, across contexts and across time, that the person will act in ways that are coherent with who they are, and with the responsibilities they've taken on. Carol at Alexandria and Carol in the field, and Carol breaking down in season 10 are all the same person, even when they look nothing alike. What makes them the same person, what makes Daryl trust her across all those contexts, is not a consistent surface presentation. It's a consistent underlying commitment to the people she loves, to their survival, to showing up even when showing up costs her something real. The difference the show draws, I think, the difference between Carol's unknowability as something trustworthy and the governor's unknowability as something lethal, is this. The governor's hidden parts serve the governor. Carol's hidden parts serve the people she loves. The unknowable regions in each of them point in different directions, and that direction, more than the knowledge or the transparency, is what trust actually needs to rest on. Rick Grimes is the person the franchise trusts with its narrative, and over 9 seasons, the show slowly, honestly, without ever losing its care for him, demonstrates that the person most trusted to lead is also the person whose trust decisions most consistently produce collateral damage. Look at the pattern. Rick trusts Shane with his family, his safety, his absence. And Shane becomes the thing that makes absence permanent by deciding the old friendship rules don't apply. Rick trusts the prison's walls with everyone inside them, trusts the council structure with the community's governance, and then overrides the council when a crisis arrives that feels too urgent for deliberation. Rick trusts his own read on the Alexandrians' limitations enough to begin positioning for a takeover before anyone has asked him to, and nearly destroys the trust the Alexandrians had placed in the process of community building. Rick trusts Carl's letter enough to spare Negan, and loses Maggie's trust in doing so, and never gets it back. There's a sequence in Season 4 where Rick is hiding under a bed while members of the claimed group, brutal men, the kind who operate entirely outside any trust framework, move through the house. He hears them and holds himself still and makes no sound. He is, in that moment, entirely alone, in a way that the show rarely allows. No community, no group, no one to be responsible for or accountable to. Just a man under a bed, trying to breathe quietly, surviving on pure distrust of everything around him. He gets out eventually, through the kind of violence that distrust sometimes requires. But something about that sequence, the silence, the stillness, the radical aloneness, lingers. It shows us a Rick who is, when stripped of everything the trust network provides, still capable of survival, but barely, and at a cost that the camera catches in his face afterward. The specific look of someone who has been alone in the worst way and does not want to be that again. Rick trusts Carl's vision enough to spare Negan in the Season 8 finale. And I want to be careful here, because this is one of the most contested decisions in the franchise's run. Carl's letter asked Rick to try for a different kind of future. Rick honoured that request in the most costly way available, by doing the thing that alienated Maggie permanently, that fractured the group's internal trust in a way that took seasons to partially repair, that required him to stand in front of Maggie's grief and ask her to accept something she had not agreed to. The decision was not wrong in the framework of the theory we're building. It was an act of trust in Carl's wisdom, in the possibility of a different future, in the idea that trust can be extended even toward people who have given you every reason not to extend it. But it cost Maggie's trust in Rick specifically, and perhaps completely. And that cost is real, and the show doesn't minimize it. Rick is the person most people in this universe trust. Does he deserve it? I think he does, mostly in the ways that matter most. He doesn't deceive the people he leads. He carries the weight of leadership without turning it into personal power. He makes the calls and accepts responsibility for them. But what it costs the people who trust him, the collateral damage of his reactive trust model, the people who pay the price of his good intentions, that's the question the show keeps raising without resolving. Trust placed in Rick is trust placed in a person doing their best in an impossible situation, which is maybe the most honest thing that can be said about any of the trust relationships in this universe. And that's where the pattern starts to click, or at least it might. The people who built Terminus were survivors. That's the first thing to hold on to, before the horror of what Terminus became. They built it as a genuine sanctuary, a place where the signs were real, the promise was real, the welcome was real, and people came. And the people who came did what Terminus's founders feared the world had become. They took, violated, destroyed. The community that had opened itself was devastated by its own openness. And then the founders reclaimed it and changed it, and the welcome sign stayed up, but the welcome was gone. replaced by something that used the form of trust. The sign, the gate, the promise of safety, as a mechanism for the exact opposite of trust. The inversion is the most disturbing and most instructive thing about Terminus. The community didn't become trustless. It became inversely trustworthy. Its internal trust among the survivors of the original violation was deep and absolute. They would protect each other, depend on each other, commit together to the survival practice they'd developed. But the external trust, the trust offered to strangers, the trust that the original Terminus had been built on, was turned into a weapon. Every sign that said sanctuary now meant trap. The form of trust preserved, the content inverted. Oceanside offers a different failure mode, and the contrast with Terminus is exactly what makes both of them instructive. Oceanside was not violated by predatory strangers. They were decimated by the saviors, all the men shot, the survivors fleeing to the coast, building a hidden community organized around the principle that no one outside could be trusted. Their response to violation was not inversion, but withdrawal. Radical internal trust combined with absolute external distrust. They trust each other completely in the specific way of people who have survived together and have only each other left. They trust no one outside in the specific way of people who have learned that the outside world includes the kind of people who would shoot all your men. What determined which direction each community went? I've thought about this question, and I want to hold the answer loosely because I don't think the show gives us a clean answer, but a possible read. Terminus's violation came from strangers who used Terminus's own openness against it, who exploited the trust the community had built rather than simply attacking it. The form of the violation, the betrayal of something extended, may have produced the specific inversion that followed. We will use the form of what was used against us. Oceanside's violation came from an external force that simply imposed power. No pretense of trust, no exploitation of offered openness. The form of that violation was simple domination, and Oceanside's response was withdrawal rather than inversion. They didn't learn to weaponize trust because trust wasn't what was weaponized against them. Both patterns, predation and isolation, are what violated trust builds when there's no path back to genuine trust available. And both of them are forms of grief. The grief of Terminus expressed as predatory control. The grief of Oceanside expressed as self-protective hiding. The people who built both communities were not monsters initially, and not cowards. They were people whose trust had been broken at the founding level, and who built around that break in the ways the break made available to them. Which direction does a violated community go? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm curious whether people see a pattern in the factors that determine it. The show doesn't resolve this cleanly, and I think that's deliberate. Both Terminus and Oceanside represent possible responses to the same fundamental injury. Both are understandable. Neither is fully right. And somewhere in the space between them, in the question of what it would take to build something after that kind of violation that was neither predatory nor isolated, is where the franchise's most careful hope lives. Let me lay out the theory as carefully as I can. Not as a certainty, the show is too honest for certainties, but as the pattern I've been seeing across the entire franchise in the specific shape it takes when you trace it from the Atlanta camp to Dead City. Trust in The Walking Dead survives when it has three conditions present simultaneously. The first is behavioral consistency over time. The characters who are genuinely trusted in this universe, Daryl, Glenn, Herschel, Michonne, in her later seasons, are trusted not because they are transparent or fully known, but because their behavior is predictable in the ways that matter. You know what Daryl will do when someone he loves is threatened. You know what Glenn will do when a stranger needs help. You know what Herschel will counsel when the group faces a decision that requires long-view thinking. This predictability, not sameness, not simplicity, but the reliable expression of consistent underlying values, is what makes trust between these people possible. The unpredictable person is not necessarily dangerous, but they are, in this universe's terms, not fully trustable. Carol, brilliant as she is not fully trusted by the community because the community can't reliably predict her. They can depend on her. That's different, but they can't trust her the way they trust Daryl because depending on someone and trusting them are not the same thing. The second condition is genuine reciprocal cost. The trust relationships that survive longest in this franchise are the ones where both parties have paid significant costs for the relationship, where the trust is weighted, invested in from both sides, carrying the specific gravity of something that was hard to build and would be expensive to lose. Rick and Daryl, Glenn and Maggie, Carol and Daryl. Each of these relationships carries a history of situations where one person's survival depended on the other, where choices were made at real personal cost, where the trust was tested and held and tested again. Cheap trust, the kind extended quickly without cost, doesn't survive the franchise's pressures. It's either broken immediately or revealed to have been something less than trust all along. The third condition is a shared framework for what counts as betrayal. This is the one that breaks most often and costs the most when it breaks. Rick and Shane trusted each other until it became clear that they were operating on fundamentally different definitions of loyalty. Shane's framework said, survival justifies what loyalty might otherwise prohibit. And Rick said, loyalty is one of the things. Survival has to be worth enough to justify. These are incompatible frameworks, and when the incompatibility became unavoidable, the trust relationship didn't just fracture, it became actively lethal. Rick and Maggie after Negan's sparing. Rick's framework said, Carl's vision deserves to be honoured. Maggie said, Glenn's death deserves justice. Both frameworks are coherent. Both are operating from genuine love and genuine loss, and they are incompatible in exactly the way that made it impossible for Rick to spare Negan without losing Maggie's trust permanently. The theory then stated as clearly as I can, the apocalypse didn't make trust impossible. It made trust expensive. It removed the social infrastructure, the laws, the institutions, the shared cultural frameworks that made certain baseline trust assumptions cheap to maintain. Without that infrastructure, every trust relationship has to be built from scratch at full cost through the accumulated weight of demonstrated reliability over time. The shortcuts are gone. The assumptions are gone. What's left is harder and slower and more fragile, and here's what the franchise keeps quietly insisting, more real. Which current franchise relationship is closest to genuine trust by these standards? I have my answer, and it involves Daryl and Carol, because that relationship has accumulated the longest demonstration of behavioral consistency, the highest mutual cost and the closest approximation of a shared betrayal framework. But I want to know yours. Drop it in the comments. That conversation is always one of my favourites with this community. Fear the Walking Dead gives us Madison Clark, and Madison gives us a different kind of trust problem. Not the trust that is built slowly over shared crisis, but the trust that is built between people who don't share a history. Madison has to construct trust relationships from scratch, in real time, under conditions that make the construction more dangerous than in any other franchise context. She doesn't have the Atlanta camp's accumulated goodwill to draw on. She doesn't have the prison's shared survival history. She has the present moment and the assessment she can make in it. And she has her children, which means her trust decisions are never purely about her own survival. They're about whether the person she's trusting will also protect Alicia and Nick. That calculus shapes everything. Madison's trust relationships across the seasons are instructive because they follow the same three-condition pattern we identified in the main series: behavioral consistency, reciprocal cost, shared betrayal framework, but the timeline is compressed. She doesn't have seasons to build the behavioral consistency. She has episodes, sometimes just scenes. And the cost of getting it wrong is higher, because the wrong trust decision in Fear's world tends to cascade in ways that the main series at least has the infrastructure of existing relationships to absorb. Madison's mistakes are more isolated, her resources for recovery thinner. The result is a character who has to make trust decisions with incomplete information at higher speed and with higher stakes, and who gets some of them wrong in ways that cost her everything, and some of them right in ways that save everything. And the show doesn't always tell you clearly which is which until it's too late to change the decision. Daryl in France is the most extreme version of the trust without history problem. He doesn't share the language. He doesn't share the cultural context for what loyalty means, what betrayal looks like, what the specific social signals that indicate trustworthiness in one culture look like in another. He has to rebuild his trust-reading capacity from scratch, in a context where the cues he's developed across 9 seasons of American Apocalypse don't fully translate. And what's interesting, and I want to flag this as my interpretation, not a confirmed statement from the spin-off's creators, is that Daryl manages it. Not easily, not quickly, but he builds relationships in France that carry the specific weight of genuine trust across the language barrier, through the cultural difference, which suggests that the 3 conditions we've been tracking might be more fundamental than the cultural forms they take, that behavioral consistency, reciprocal cost, and shared betrayal framework are legible across contexts in ways that the surface forms of trust aren't. Dead City is the franchise's most explicit exploration of whether trust can be rebuilt after catastrophic betrayal, and what makes it specifically interesting is the condition under which the rebuilding is being attempted. Glenn is not there. The thing that was destroyed, the specific person, the specific life, the specific love, is permanently absent. Maggie can't rebuild trust with Negan by having Glenn back. She can only build a different trust, provisional, operational, maintained through vigilance rather than warmth, and the show treats that as real. Not as a lesser form, not as something that needs to eventually become what Glenn and Maggie had, as its own legitimate form of the thing, a trust that knows what it is and what it isn't, and maintains itself honestly within those terms. The fence in France looks different. The physical boundaries are different. The cultural context for what a fence means, what it protects, who it keeps out, what it says about the people who built it, has its own textures. But the trust boundary operates the same way. The space between two people who are deciding whether to be responsible for each other. That space is not culturally specific. It's human. And Daryl navigating it in a foreign language, reading behavioural consistency in unfamiliar forms, paying costs that he can't always name. That's the franchise's argument that what we've been tracing isn't just an American apocalypse problem. It's the human trust problem, restated in every context the franchise enters. Here's what I want to propose, carefully and with the humility appropriate to a theory rather than a certainty. Trust in The Walking Dead is not primarily a moral category. It's not mainly about honesty or goodness or virtue, though those things are part of it. It's a survival mechanism with specific operational characteristics, and understanding it as a survival mechanism explains things about the franchise that are otherwise hard to account for. Trust reduces decision latency. When you trust someone, you don't have to reassess their likely behaviour every time you need to act in concert with them. You can assume, on the basis of demonstrated behavioural consistency, that they will do what they've done before, which means you can act on that assumption without the delay of recalculation. In a world where the wrong decision by a moment costs lives, that reduction in decision latency is not a small thing. Rick and Daryl can operate together in crisis situations with a coordination that doesn't require communication because their trust relationship has made each other's behaviour legible enough to anticipate. That coordination, trust as operational shortcut, is a survival advantage that the characters without it don't have. Trust enables division of labour. Communities in this universe function because different people have different skills and are willing to deploy those skills on behalf of the community rather than hoarding them for personal survival. That deployment requires trust. You have to trust that the person doing the medical work will also benefit from the person doing the watch duty, which requires trusting that both of them will continue to participate in the system rather than defecting when the system becomes costly. The Hilltop's ability to maintain agricultural production while also defending itself requires every person in it to trust that the structure they're participating in will continue to function for them. Without that trust, the division of labour collapses into pure self-interest, and the community becomes ungovernable. Trust provides the emotional sustenance that makes survival worth sustaining. This one is the hardest to quantify and the most important. The Walking Dead keeps showing us characters who can survive physically but are dying in some other way. Morgan in Clear, Carol in Season 10's worst episodes, Rick in the period after Laurie's death. Physical survival without emotional connection is, in this universe, a form of death by another name. The found family network, the specific trust relationships that constitute the group's reason for going on, is the thing that makes the effort of surviving meaningful. Without trust, you have people staying alive for no reason they can name, and people who can't name a reason tend to eventually stop. But here's what I find most interesting about the franchise's consistent evidence. The enemies know this. Negan didn't just attack communities with force, he attacked the trust structures. We Are All Negan is specifically a dismantling of horizontal trust within the saviors, and an attempt to undermine it between the communities he dominated. Alpha and the Whisperers killed to break trust relationships. They targeted people who were loved, who were needed, who carried specific trust weight in the communities they were part of. Dante, the Whisperer sleeper agent who infiltrated Alexandria in Season 10, was specifically positioned to destroy trust from within. The enemy always goes for the trust first, which means the franchise has been quietly showing us, from multiple angles, that trust is not just valuable, it's the primary strategic target, the thing that, if you can break it, breaks everything else with it. The fence transforms in this chapter's light. It's no longer just the barrier between wanting to trust and being unable to. It's the form trust actually takes, a structure that both separates and connects, that makes proximity possible without requiring merger, that defines the relationship between inside and outside in ways that make both possible. A fence isn't the absence of a relationship. It's a specific kind of relationship, bounded, maintained, negotiated, and trust in this universe is the fence, the boundary between two people that makes contact possible without requiring one of them to disappear into the other. You stay on your side, I stay on mine. And across this specific distance, between these specific chain links, we decide to be responsible for each other anyway. Glenn trusted until it killed him. That's the fact. And the fact is devastating. And the show knew it was devastating when it made the choice. But let's stay with what it means that Glenn was still, in the moment before the bat, fully himself. He hadn't been worn down into strategic distrust. He hadn't learned the lesson that survival in this universe seems to require. He was, at the moment of his death, the same person he was on the radio in the tank in Season 1. Someone who moves toward people in trouble, who cannot hold himself still when someone he loves is being hurt, who trusts the basic rules of social interaction even when those rules are being administered by someone who has given every indication that he doesn't share them. Herschel trusted until he was mid-sentence. That's the form his death takes, an argument for peace interrupted by violence. He was wrong to trust the governor in that specific moment. The governor had already made clear he wasn't interested in the argument. But Herschel's trust wasn't naivety, it was commitment. He had decided, across a long life and a shortened world, that the argument for peace was worth making even when the person on the other side couldn't hear it. He trusted the idea that making the argument mattered, even if this particular iteration was about to end. And the sword that ends him doesn't prove him wrong. It just proves the world was not ready for what he was offering. Beth believed people were still essentially good. She sang when she could. She kept hope, not as a naive act, but as a deliberate one, as a choice to maintain something the world kept trying to take. And the world took her, in the kind of arbitrary, almost accidental violence that the show sometimes uses when it wants to demonstrate that the good die not from punishment but from exposure. Beth was exposed. The world found the exposure. That's not an argument against what she was. It's an argument against a world that couldn't protect it. Father Gabriel begins at the opposite pole, a man who violated trust catastrophically, who locked his congregation out of his church during the outbreak and listened to them die because he was afraid. He carries that guilt for seasons. It shapes how he relates to the group, how he relates to himself, how he processes every subsequent decision about when to open doors and when to keep them closed. His arc is the franchise's most complete portrait of trust, violated from the inside. The person who broke the trust between himself and the people who depended on him, who then has to find a way to rebuild not just others' trust in him, but his own trust in himself. He manages it slowly and painfully, without the show ever pretending it was easy or complete. He becomes trustworthy, genuinely trustworthy, not performing trustworthiness, through a process of demonstrated change across many seasons. His arc is, in its own way, the franchise's most hopeful argument about trust, that it can be rebuilt even by the person who broke it, if the rebuilding is real and sustained. Is The Walking Dead ultimately arguing that trust is worth having even when it costs everything? I think it is, not because the show has a neat answer to offer. It doesn't, but because the characters who keep trusting are treated with a specific and consistent reverence that the characters who stop trusting never quite receive. Glenn is mourned in a way that reflects the show's acknowledgement that what died with him was not just a person, but a specific orientation toward other people that the world could not afford to lose. Herschel's death is staged as a tragedy, not a warning. Beth is held tenderly by the narrative even as the narrative takes her. These deaths are not arguments for stopping. They're arguments for what was worth stopping for. If you could choose between surviving alone and trusting people who might get you killed, what would you choose? I don't think it's really a choice. The Walking Dead keeps showing us characters who try to survive alone. Morgan in Clear, Rick in his worst periods, Carol in season 10. And what they all find is that aloneness and survival are ultimately incompatible. Not because you can't physically survive, but because survival without trust is a form of death that just takes longer. Let's go back to the fence. Two people, chain links, neither moving, neither speaking, the space between them as the territory where the question lives. Is this person safe? Can I afford this? What does it cost if I reach through? And what does it cost if I don't? Here's what I know now, after everything we've traced tonight, that I didn't know at the beginning. The fence isn't the problem. The fence is the solution. Or more precisely, the fence is what trust looks like when it's honest about what it is. A boundary that makes proximity possible without requiring full merger. A structure that says, I will stand here on my side and be responsible for what I can see, and you will stand on yours. The people who try to tear the fence down entirely, who insist on no boundaries, complete openness, trust extended unconditionally in all directions, tend to be destroyed by it. The people who never come to the fence at all, who live behind walls so deep the fence is irrelevant, tend to die of the specific loneliness that makes survival feel pointless. The fence is the thing in between, the relationship that is neither merger nor isolation, the form that trust takes in a world where full openness is lethal and full closure is death by another name. Rick's policy, we don't go out anymore, we bring people in, is a fence policy. It doesn't say no one ever. It says on our terms, at our pace, with our assessment of who comes through. It's trust made procedural, trust given a structure, rather than left to instinct. After Woodbury, after Shane, after everything the instinct version of trust had cost, that's the most Rick can manage, and it's not a failure. It's the fence at the right distance, close enough to let people through, far enough to do the assessment before they arrive. Maybe trust in The Walking Dead is impossible in the way it was in the old world. Easy, ambient, sustained by infrastructure that the world no longer maintains. The old trust was built on the assumption that most people, most of the time, were operating within a shared set of rules that constrained the worst of what they might do. The apocalypse took those constraints away, and what's left is not a world without trust, but a world where trust has to be earned from scratch, through demonstrated consistency, through reciprocal cost, through the slow accumulation of evidence that the person on the other side of the fence is reliably who they've been showing you they are. That's harder, it's slower, it's more fragile. It can be broken by a single decision that violates the framework both parties thought they shared. But it's also, I think, more real than the old trust was. Because the old trust was partly assumption, partly the social contracts doing the work that genuine knowledge of people would otherwise require. The new trust has no assumption. It has only what's been demonstrated. And what's demonstrated at cost across time, under pressure, that might be the only trust that was ever worth having. Glenn trusted the way the old world made trust cheap. His trust was real, the most real in the franchise, but it was also unreformed by the new world's requirements. He reached through the fence without doing the fence's work first, and the world took him for it. And what Maggie learned, what Carol learned, what Daryl has always quietly known, is how to do the fence's work, how to stand at the boundary and do the assessment, and then, when the assessment is complete, reach through. Not rashly, not as a reflex, as a choice. Is there anyone in your life you trust the way Glenn trusted people, before you knew what it would cost? And if you lost what Glenn lost, would you trust them again? I think The Walking Dead's answer, the quiet, patient, franchise-long answer, is yes, not despite the cost, because of it. Because trust that costs you nothing isn't trust. It's just an assumption waiting to be corrected. And trust that costs you everything, that was the real thing. That was Glenn. That was Herschel. That was Beth singing. The fence is still there. Someone is still standing on the other side of it. Come a little closer. Let's see who it is.